Hello, this is Mark Schneiderman with the Software and Information Industry Association. Thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar on the student data privacy landscape. Did I say my name? I'm sorry. Mark Schneiderman with SIIA. We're going to run through a couple announcements and then introduce our speakers, and we'll move right into today's discussion. So as you heard, this webinar is being recorded, and we will archive the recording and the slide presentation for access to SI members moving forward. If you have any questions, and we encourage you to ask them, please do so in the chat window. Let's turn to some announcements. So SI has two surveys open right now: our market survey for companies to help us identify the size of the market, and then our educator survey, the vision survey. Both those are open until April, or into April. We also have several upcoming events. Our Education Government Forum on Mobile Learning is in DC on March 18th to 19th. And issues such as privacy and E-rate and state policies will be on our agenda there. We also have the final of our 4-part Common Core for Publishers series coming up February 27th. Today's speakers are Paige Kowalski, Director of State Policy and Advocacy with the Data Quality Campaign, and Yvonne Streichenberger, CEO of InBloom. Paige will speak first in a moment. She joined the Data Quality Campaign in 2008 and works to promote the essential role of education data in making instructional management and policy decisions. She manages the DQC's efforts to support state policymakers in understanding their roles and responsibilities in supporting effective use of data at all levels. From 2006 to 2008, Paige managed several national data initiatives for the Council of Chief State School Officers, and prior to that was with the University of California, with the city and counties of San Francisco, and with Chicago Public Schools. Yvonne Streichenberger joined InBloom as its CEO in November 2012 and helped establish it as a nonprofit enterprise. He joined InBloom from his role as President of Learner Response Systems and Assessment in Promethean. Prior to Promethean, Yvonne managed Houghton Mifflin's global strategy, corporate development, and M&A activity. Immediately after its Vivendi Universal acquisition, or its acquisition by Vivendi Universal, and throughout the LBO. During those years, he was president of EduSoft, led Classwell, and was involved in various other efforts at Vivendi and Houghton Mifflin. He began his career with Bain & Company, the Boston Consulting Group, and L'Oreal South Africa. And perhaps most importantly, Yvonne, you served several times on the SI Education Division Board. So let me just set a little bit of context, and then we'll move right into our presentations. So our education system is really just starting to realize the potential of data. At the same time, people are realizing they didn't really understand or know some of these developments in the effective use of data. And so it's leading to a lot of, the ignorance, I think, is leading to some fear and some of the concerns. We're seeing a lot of concerns in the field, concerns about whether educators are minding the store, so to speak, whether policies are going too far or not enough, whether data is being sold or not sold. Some of these are real, some perceived. Our speakers will get much more into these. A lot of conflating agendas and issues here. So how much of the discussion and debate is about student personal information, and how much of it is about other issues? All of this, of course, is leading to a lot of state and federal legislative proposals. Most concerning are proposals that would allow families to opt out of using any third-party service when that data is involved, and of course that would be incredibly disruptive to teachers having to figure out who's part of a system and who's not. But we're also seeing a lot of other kinds of proposals that would put in requirements about security, about transparency, and they're really running the gamut. And I think we're also seeing a lot of confusion between personally identifiable information and other uses of anonymous information. So SI has been doing a lot of work in this area, and we've been trying to help the media, education leaders, policymakers understand that, look, schools have a long tradition in collecting, using, and sharing data and working with third parties, whether those are service providers online or other more traditional partners. There's certainly a need to safeguard student data, privacy and security, and we see a strong network of laws and policies and practices in place that are helping do that. Those include FERPA, which limits sharing of information with third-party providers to educational purposes. We also have the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which again requires consent, allows schools to step in and provide consent for children under 13, but only where there's an educational purpose and not a separate commercial purpose. And of course, we have schools have contracts with providers. There are penalties in place, and there's certainly a market incentive for SI members and others in the sector to respect and student privacy and ensure student security. In addition to some of the legislation that is pending across the states, there also is a lot of discussion about model contracts and agreements, technical assistance, establishment of chief privacy officers, best practices, training. I think we're seeing a lot of efforts going on right now to help perhaps the industry, the schools catch up to where maybe they should have been on some of these issues. And SI is working with a lot of organizations, including our two guests today and many others. Some of the organizations listed here are representing educators, trying to inform them. Some are concerned and criticizing the lack of privacy and security in the sector and helping bring that to light. And we want to make sure SIIA, as discussions about privacy and security move forward, that people are well informed about what is going on, what should go on, and some of the unintended consequences of some of the proposed actions. As many of you know, data is a complicated area in terms of the varying types of data, the various uses of data, the various ways it's collected and shared. So we want to make sure that we allow the innovation to take place, because we all know that we're really just at the beginning of stages of how education can more effectively use data to improve student learning. And finally, just a sampling of some of the work that SI has been doing. This webinar, we had a webinar in December with the U.S. Department of Education on FERPA. We put out a summary of what COPPA means for operations in schools. We've got an SI member working group diving deep on some of the legislative issues. We've testified in several states, sent letters to others, and working in many others not listed here. Kind of a snapshot of, or maybe a running capture of some of these efforts. You can see by reading the SI blogs, both under public policy and privacy, as well as under my name, Mark Schneiderman. So with that, just set a little bit of context. I want to turn things over to Paige Kowalski, who will share some of the Thinking at Data Quality campaign. I think a year ago, Paige would not have probably expected that she would become one of the nation's foremost experts in state data privacy. But I think that's what's evolved because of their efforts to step up and help lead the sector. So, Paige, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And you're right. But I have to say, working with data, I never know what to expect is coming next. So stay tuned for what I may be an expert on in 2015. So thank you, Mark, for inviting me to do this, and good afternoon or morning to everyone on the phone, depending on what time zone you're sitting in right now. We've been a partner with SIA for some time now, and they've been really helpful to us as this privacy conversation has gotten bigger and bigger and has started to evolve a little bit, particularly as folks are asking questions now about online services and cloud storage, and I'm in advocacy and policy. I'm not technical or I really struggle describing the cloud to people. I still don't use iCloud with my iPhone and Mac because I still don't really know what it is. So we struggle and really rely on partners like Mark and SIA to help us really navigate these waters. And so I'm happy to share with you the policy and advocacy pieces that we do feel like we excel in, and hopefully this will help you all in the states that you're in and as you think about how to talk about some of these issues and how to navigate this space. So I hope you all have something like this in your own toolbox as you're talking to people. We have found it really helpful, particularly when we're talking with the media or with legislators, because this conversation right now is so abstract, talking about the cloud or hacking or all these what-if scenarios are out there. What if the 10th grade teacher learns that my child had a discipline problem in elementary school? There's so many pictures being painted out there and fears that we wanted to actually create a new visual for people to ground this conversation and take it out of the abstract and out of the what-ifs and bring it into a classroom and show how teachers use data all year long, that it's the basis of a conversation about student learning at different points during the year with students, with parents, with other teachers, with principals, with counselors, and that this is what we're trying to get to. If you're in a state, this is the image we're trying to support. And as we think about policies and legislation and privacy, we want to ensure that this picture can still happen and help people understand where does this picture start to fall apart if we don't have the types of technology or the tools or the dashboards, the analytics, the data collected. How do we make this happen? So I just want to ground that in something that's real and encourage you all to do the same, particularly when you're put in an uncomfortable position and asked tough questions about what you do, is to remember that you're trying to solve a real problem for kids and teachers and families. Traditionally, when we've been talking about privacy, particularly at the policymaker level, we've relied on FERPA. It's a 40-year-old law. It doesn't have anything to do with security or online services or Google or anything like that. It was simply meant to protect privacy and define the types of disclosure of PII that are permissible. And it's changed a little bit over time, but we've all sort of gotten into this comfortable space where we say we're protecting privacy because we're FERPA compliant. That is losing some meaning to folks out there, and so we've had to revisit what that really means. And that's largely because we've had this evolution in how we collect, store, and secure data. And again, this is not my expertise at all, which is why you have this incredible simplification of what probably many of you do. But it helps parents in particular understand this evolution and remember back to that idea of that permanent record, that manila folder that we know today never really existed, but it still exists in our minds. And we moved to electronic, and now we're talking about cloud and online services and digital data and things just moving quickly and access and timeliness being better. But I think that's part of the worry, is this access issue. When it's not at the school building anymore, what does that really mean? So it's causing us to answer some really tough questions about privacy and security. So as more folks are getting data, because we've got all these tools and dashboards and states have started to think about how they can provide services around this, there's just more awareness out there about the fact that this data even exists. And as we all know, education data isn't new. What is new is that we're thinking of ways to use it that actually work for families and teachers. We're taking that same data that was collected for accountability and compliance and actually putting it to work. And that's causing people to be aware that it was being collected in the first place. And they're asking some really legitimate questions. And, and there are people out there that live in a space in the extremes, but I encourage you to think about the vast majority of busy, overworked parents that, get pieces of paper at, they finally dig into their kid's backpack at 10 o'clock at night if they ever do, and really have them in mind as you think about how to communicate with them and help them understand what you're trying to do. And they've got questions, and they don't have time to dig around on websites and FAQ and media reports to get to the facts. So we need to keep it simple for them. We've seen a number of myths. I'm sure none of these are new to you. What's being collected, who has access to it, why are vendors involved, what happens if there's a data breach, and who's in charge of all of this. But we're seeing these emerging ones, and I think this is where you all can certainly be helpful to me as I'm trying to understand this world. We know teachers are using things like Dropbox and Google Docs. This isn't the traditional student data and the traditional data collection that we've talked about for so long that FERPA covers. It's not courses, grades, enrollment, demographics. It's this data that's sort of, almost accidentally generated inside of a school because of the type of service or tool or storage solution that the student or the teacher is using. And parents are sort of conflating this kind of data. Oh, my student uses Edmodo and they put assignments up and they chat and they interact with their teacher, who's protecting them. That's getting conflated with this other issue around the types of traditional student data. And I think you see this confusion particularly, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Common Sense media survey that just came out. I think that was more reflective of this conversation, that online protection, but got so mixed in with data privacy issues around our typical traditional student data collection. I put in here, I don't know how many of you are active on Twitter. I chat with this guy all the time. He helps me learn. He's a good critical friend. He's much more technical than me and asks me questions and is helping me learn at the same time. But I was going to try and do bullets of what he was talking about, but I thought his questions were so well worded and we're hearing variations of these everywhere. We just don't know how to talk about them. And by we, I mean policymakers, people like me. You probably do, because you're creating many of these services, Google Docs, and I don't even know what half the stuff is, an MS360 account, and turn it in. So I think these are the issues that are starting to concern people in this space, and there's a real opportunity here to engage with people about some solutions. So we have all these sort of symptoms out there of the problem. The diagnosis on all of this, similar to the Common Core issues, there's been a lack of communication with parents and the public in general around the value of the data that we're collecting and the systems in place to protect privacy. So they have fair, legitimate questions about this because we haven't done a good job telling them. Our need for data and our technology are evolving faster than our policies are, so there's some gaps there. We, as in all of us, everyone on the phone, myself, state policymakers, federal policymakers, teachers, district administrators, we don't know how to talk about privacy. We get caught up in encryption. We get caught up in statements like, that our lawyers make us put in there about we can't guarantee the security of your data. None of this builds trust. None of this makes people feel good about what we're doing. And there's a lack of understanding how to address this personal nature of privacy and build trust. We all use Facebook. Some of us share a lot. Some of us don't share very much, and our definitions of what we think is private comes out there. And how do you regulate and pass laws knowing that everybody views privacy so differently? And some people are very open and trusting and would share everything and assume good intentions, and some people just hold everything sort of close to the vest. So we know that we need to strengthen our communications and privacy policies. We have 3 overarching recommendations for states. They need to do a better job of answering the who, what, where, and when of data collection and use. Who's collecting it? By what authority? What are you collecting? Who has access to it? Where is it stored? How is it protected? Communicating the value of that data and dispelling myths, getting the facts out, and doing it quickly. I do think we've come a long way on the second piece. I see fewer and fewer myths out there. And they're evolving over time. And then just the hard part is really identifying those policy gaps. and the legislative gaps and filling them with policies that are proactive and constructive rather than just prohibitive. Rather than just saying you can't collect this or you can't link this or you can't contract in this way, it's more about setting up a system that enables those decisions to be made and enables accountability at the end. Some advice we're giving folks around legislation, and there's some links in here if you want to take a look at, ensuring that governance is the primary focus of the legislation. We can't just focus on K-12. This is happening in early childhood, higher ed, workforce. We're linking all of this data together. So we've talked a lot about that Oklahoma legislation, but it really does just affect affects K-12. Helping states think and legislators think about ways you can support schools and districts. You may have seen the report that came out from Joel Reidenberg. And whatever your opinion of that study was, I mean, there's some truth there that districts and schools don't really have the capacity or the expertise to get great policies and contracts in place, so they need some help thinking about a chief privacy officer and thinking about some accountability and civil penalties. Again, focusing on transparency, governance, and accountability. Just a quick update on where we were. I think this is even out of date. I think it's 42 bills from 21 states. We know there's some more states that are in the draft stage. We've taken a stab at looking, are they mostly just about prohibiting things? That doesn't make it a bad bill. It just means, if your goal is privacy and your bill says you can't collect biometric data, that may be fine. That's a great bill if your goal is to prevent biometric data from being collected. But if your goal is protecting student data privacy, that's not going to get you there. So we've taken a stab. We've got about 25 that are just prohibitive and about 18 that are really trying to get to some form of governance, transparency, and accountability to date. And some good models starting to emerge that are taking this a step further. We're seeing executive orders. Governors are getting in on reaffirming where they stand on data and privacy. State boards are much more involved, and I think this will be a big year for them. I think in states, whether the legislature moves or not, I think the state board will. They'll fill gaps. They'll preempt legislation and try to act on their own as opposed to being legislated. I've also listed a few resources. We have a whole privacy section on our website with a whole bunch of resources, but we've sort of chunked these out. Resources that help you communicate better why data matters, some resources that help you get the facts out and debunk the myths, and then some resources around just safeguarding data. FERPA, there's a privacy primer. All of these have recommendations for policymakers if you're having conversations with them. Just a good resource to have in your toolkit. Contact information for me if you have any follow-up questions or questions about our resources. And with that, I will turn it over to Yvonne.
Great. Thank you so much, Paige. Great overview. Yvonne, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Paige, and thanks, Mark and Karen, for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here because, as Mark said, I've been a board member of SIF for many years. I've been in the industry for 13 years, and I'm really very candidly will share some of the battle scars that InBloom has had and had over the last 14 months. So it's really a transparent sharing of some of the things we learned. And what I'm going to do is give you a very, very quick recap of what InBloom is first before I go through the lesson learned. So InBloom was launched actually in 2011 under the name SLC. It's a nonprofit that was initiated by CCSSO and various organizations and state leaders, funded by Carnegie and Gates. And as you can see on the slide, we are a plumbing solution. Our goal is to connect disparate legacy systems with each other, reduce the cost. So there is a technology element, which is building the system to do this. There is an awareness element, which is working with customers, SCAs and LEAs, to understand how they can be more efficient and how they can reduce the cost. And there's a third element, which is working with the vendors to make your life easier, to reduce your cost, to make it much, much easier to deploy those solutions. And InBloom, for better or for worse, was focusing initially on large states. The reason for that basically was scale and impact. We can talk about that, and there are some challenges with that approach. InBloom was launched in a very difficult context. When I started at InBloom 14 months ago, some of the noise was coming, but I did not expect, very honestly, that much tension, that much noise in the markets. You know most of these things, but the Common Core rollout was starting and already getting some activity, both for and against. There were changes being done on FERPA, and as Paige said, it's an old law which has quite a few gaps that need to be addressed. At the same time, we had all the Snowden revelations around NSA and PRISM. Still a lot of noise around teacher effectiveness. It's been going on for a long time, but it's a very sensitive topic. And to make things even better, some major publicized data breaches, Target, Neiman Marcus, and I think there were a few more in the last few days. And then you add on top of this the political element. Several states and districts basically are through election year. And what we realize is those topics of data privacy and security have become very, very political topics. Paige mentioned some bills being passed. It's really interesting to see a lot of legislators embarking on that journey, making comments, and as you will hear later, it's a very complex topic. And most of our legislators are pulling from that topic. And the last one, the last two, is a lack of, if I may say so, a lack of preparation from states, districts, and potentially the industry as well for that debate and those discussions. Clearly, states and districts, for the most part, are not really ready yet to have those discussions. They don't have privacy policies for most of the time. They don't have rules and regulations of what they store along the store. So the work done by DQC is paramount, but overall, they're not well prepared yet. And in parallel, I think, speaking for myself, having been in the industry for a few years, I don't think the industry was well prepared to really comment on best practices for privacy and say for sure we had heavy security put in place. So all these factors basically brought together led to a very, very tough environment. And I put in there some quotes about InBloom specifically, but you can probably replace InBloom in some cases by other company names. And I've just put the soft ones. You see some really crazy things, identity theft, selling stockpile of data for vendors, make a profit, multi-agency surveillance programs. We have a laundry list of comments like this. Now, and I won't spend too much time on that, but when you compare to InBloom, what InBloom does, there is obviously a huge disconnect. And it's interesting because we've been saying that again and again and again. But as I mentioned before, there is politics. There are a lot of forces in play, and it's also very complicated. So it's really important, as Paige mentioned before, to use the right words, to tell the story in simple terms, not to hide behind legalese and technical elements. And it's complicated because, as I said earlier, privacy and security are very complicated topics. You can't make bold statements like all the data is secured all the time. So really, really complicated to pick the right words, but also to simplify the message. But in a nutshell, basically, InBloom acts as a vault. Think about like a safe deposit box in a bank. A client goes to the bank, store data in that bank, and then can pull the data whenever he or she wants. Most people don't know that InBloom does not even see the data. We don't see it. We don't have access to it. We don't have the encryption keys. We don't have the authority or the right to use encryption keys. So what have we learned from that process? So far, we have a few battle scars, but we learned a lot. The first one is that we have a tendency to overestimate the level of knowledge on that topic from parents, district superintendents and officials, state officials, legislators. It's extremely emotional, more emotional than anything else I've seen in education. We are talking to several legislators right now, and what we realize is, at least on one of them, is that the topic has become very sensitive because that person has a special ed child, and that person is taking a very personal approach to the problem. The other thing we learned, which is really interesting, is that for a lot of people, parents primarily, but also educators, the problem is not clear. We talk about personalized learning. We talk about the benefit of technology, but there is a very strong, nothing new there, but there's a strong denial of the problem. So in many cases, we talk about the solution, but I don't think, at least in the case of InBloom, we've done a really good job to articulate what the pain point is, what the problem is, and why those tools are absolutely required, why our technology can help solve a real problem. The other thing we learned as well is that InBloom has been a bit of a lightning rod, and I have to say very candidly, sometimes we felt a little lonely trying to explain some of these concepts and push the use of technology and the benefit of data. I'm not talking about DQC, but with the vendors. But everybody has a big role to play. I mean, every one of you, especially I've had with Mark and Karen, I think it's really important that each and every player in the industry has this dialogue with clients, partners, even employees as well. Everybody has a role to play here. There is a big challenge with communication, press, and media. Right now, it's much more, right now. In the last 10 or 15 years, most of the news is around drama. What is dramatic? What are the big scandals? And there is not a lot of appetite for real in-depth discussions on complex topics. So the press will jump basically on data breach. The press will jump on what happens, what could happen, what if. That's what Paige was referring to before. So we have to be prepared for a lot of noise from a very small but very vocal minority, which is driven by multiple elements. And the last thing is it's really important that we all prepared with good practices around privacy and security. It's tempting to think that InBloom is taking most of the heat, but let's be very clear. That's becoming a very large issue for everyone. We can all expect a lot of scrutiny from various players around security and privacy. And I'll talk about some of the things that can be done and some of the things we learn along those lines. Just to take a second on what I would call the trust framework, and a very, very simplified description of the roles that various players can play. At the bottom, you see the federal government, and the federal government probably with FERPA and potentially more is putting in place the basic safeguards. What you see is a lot of action at the state level. I think, Paige, you mentioned, 40 bills. On our last count, we counted 124 bills in 40 states. They're not all directly related to privacy, but they include privacy and security elements in education. So there is a huge activity right now in states. And to be clear, some states are better equipped than others to come up with the right bills. In many, many cases, those state legislators do not necessarily have the right information to understand the trade-off between pushing privacy and very far and the impact on education, or basically being a little more loose, but then exposing student data. What we see in parallel as well is districts and schools coming up with their own rules as well. And the more you go up in the pyramid, the more specific it gets. And obviously, at the top of the chain, you have the individuals, meaning parents, teachers, and students making their own rules and decisions as well. I put in blue the industry because I think the industry has a role to play to come up with, I don't know if it's a code of conduct, best practices, or anything along those lines. There is a lot of heads turning toward the industry, towards the vendors and asking, okay, what are the rules you're going to apply to yourself? what are the lines you're prepared to cross and the lines you're not prepared to cross. And again, I think it's important for us to be prepared to have those discussions. So let me share with you very briefly some of the things that InBloom has put in place. Again, it's not exhaustive nor means to lecture anyone, but just share a few things. And really here, my goal is to invite you to contact me if you have any questions on any of those. We have a full-time Chief Privacy Officer. We have a full-time Information Security Officer as well. We've done a lot of work on those topics. We really want to be the solution, not the problem. So, and you see some of those on that list, ranging from encryption, access control, monitoring. The key thing that we learn in security, number one, is that it's always work in progress. You never win. It's a constant fight. There is no such state as being fully secure. And it's really around three activities: prevent, detect, and react. Most companies spend their resources around prevent, building strong defense, but they're absolutely not prepared in case of breach. They're absolutely not prepared to detect any problems. In the case of InBloom, for example, we have a lot of protection against breaches, but we also have multi-level of encryption. So even if in an unlikely case there was a breach, the data is encrypted twice. And then we have constant monitoring, and we have incident response as well. Our security book is more than 300 pages of activities, actions, rules, policies. The whole staff is trained on that. We also work with our partners. It's a very, very heavy program. I'm not saying it should be done by everyone, but things can be done. Some of them are easier to implement, but they're really important. It's better to know about them as opposed to just discovering them. Quickly on the privacy front, it's a complex topic because in many, many cases, the vendors do not write the policies. The states and districts write the policies, and all we can do is to enforce them. So I think that things we need to have on things we can do on our side. But again, the key thing is to work very closely with states, districts, superintendents, CIOs, CTOs to make sure they have the right policies in place, and we help them to enforce them. A few things again that we learn is, and I think Paige mentioned that, there are a lot of real concerns, and some of them are well-funded. So it's always useful to go back to being a parent. I'm a parent of I'm a dad of a 5-year-old and 7-year-old. It's always useful to go back to what do I think is right for my children. What is right in terms of data being collected. The second thing is to take those things very seriously. Do a lot of work around what you collect. Should I collect that? Do I have the proper measures of security in place for each type of data? What is sensitive? What is less? Can I document that? Can I support and tell, if I have to testify or whatever, that yes, this is a sensitive piece of data, and yes, I take that seriously, and yes, I've got the right protections in place. What's the data flow? Where is the data coming from? Where's the data going? For better or for worse, once you collect data, you're part of a larger chain, and even the data basically gets leaked later, you are on that chain, you are on that process, and you're responsible. I think some people call this like as an enabler. I mean, you facilitate breaches, even if you don't have control on that. Potentially because you were on the path of the data, you're responsible for some of that. Transparency is critical. Transparency with education officials, transparency with the parent community. That's probably a place where InBloom was not as forthcoming as it should have been. Really engaging the parent community. It's a complex topic because you have parent leaders and you have parent leaders. And unfortunately, some of the vocal ones, most vocal ones in the past few months, are not representing the parent community. It's unfortunate. So it's really important to find the right contacts, the right common sense, pragmatic parent representatives to have those discussions with them. And finally, don't wait. I know there is concern about introducing privacy language in contract, or at least there is a tendency to be overprotective for the company. Paige mentioned the Reidenberg report, the Fordham report. There is a lot of scrutiny on those contracts, and I think we can expect a lot of pushback on contracts that are one-sided, that are overprotective for the vendor, and that do not protect the rights of the schools enough. So it's going to be probably more and more important to strike a balance between what is a good protection for the company, as typically company lawyers will try to push, but also making sure it's not so overreaching that it will be attacked. Now, just to finish, what can we do? What does it mean? I think that the really key thing here is that we all have a role to play. As I said, and I've talked to Mark and Karen before, I personally would like to see more engagement from the vendor community, whether it's sharing ideas, sharing best practices, committing to a code of conduct, engaging the parents, working with clients that can explain why they need data and what they do, starting by articulating the pain points. It's really important. But I think we need to take that seriously, and my call to action is a call to action here. The second element is if there is anything we can do to inform people, we should do it. Again, legislators, districts, states, and others, there is a lack of knowledge, and in many cases there is an appetite to know more, and it's really important. If we don't get involved, we're going to have some disasters, and it's really great to have DQC involved and having a lot of those discussions, but it's important we all get engaged. Otherwise, people are going to draft some crazy legislations that will literally bring to a halt a lot of great tools that could really make a difference. We need to lead by example. As I mentioned that before, we need to have best practices. We need to be, I would call it beyond reproach, but I think we can expect more scrutiny, more pushback, more attacks. Now, things will get better. We'll get a little more pragmatic, I hope. We think so. I've talked through the last few months through a lot of experts on security and privacy in other industries, and they all told me the same thing. Things will settle down, but it might take a while. It might be painful. I think we have a role to play. We can help that, but we have to be prepared. We should expect basically a much calmer state at some point of time, but we need to act on that. So that's something I want to share with you. So really the idea that everyone has a role to play. InBloom as a nonprofit, mission-driven, is here to help. We're here to help the students, the teachers. We're also here to help the vendors. We've done a lot of work on our privacy policy. It was a big investment for the company. It was before I came on board. There was a lot of research done on that, a lot of work done on security. We would be delighted to work with all the players in the industry to share what we learn more, to share some of the best practices, to also change what we do as well, to learn from other experts. We'll get there, but I think we need to all work together to get to a place where common sense prevails over emotion and craziness.
Great.
I think there's some questions there. I couldn't read them at the same time. So, Mark, I'll let you decide.
Okay. Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Paige, again. So we have about 10 or so minutes for additional questions. There was one earlier about what is a customer, a state, a school, a company, all three. Anyone want to take a crack at that? I would think it will vary widely, but...
Let me just very quickly. I think it does depend. I mean, in our case, we talk about SCAs and LEAs. It's actually complicated. Just take a second on that, because when you work with districts, it's pretty clear. When you work with states, and that's the case for InBloom in New York, the states are not always trusted and sometimes legitimate, at least in the eyes of the public, to collect data. So maybe Paige can comment on that. But it's important, I think it's a really good question, Mitch, to really be very clear on who owns the data, who controls the data, and who has the right to the data, either directly or indirectly. Paige, correct me if I'm wrong in there, but the states have the right to the data because they're given the right by the districts. And it's important to make that distinction sometimes.
Oh, Paige, are you still on mute?
I mean, that's right. So the state can disclose the data on behalf of the district. I mean, but I think, this is a gray area going forward, and this is what I think New York has been going through that everybody else is watching is that, they have to send that data for compliance reasons to the state, but what the state does with it at that point, do they need district permission, or is this something they can just do? So I think that's the conversation that's playing out right now, and I think the most important thing is the states are going to have to show to districts and families that they're good stewards of that data and that they have good processes in place for making those decisions around disclosure so that people can trust that they'll act in the best interest of kids.
Yeah, and Paige's two key words. One is good steward, and the second thing is trust. Privacy and security is all about trust. This is probably the most critical element, is to build the trust between all the stakeholders and the players there. That's one thing which is missing, and the states do not always have the trust they need for good or bad reasons.
Yeah, and I agree with all those points. And to the customer issue, I think it overlaps with kind of the governance issue, and there's a real tension between what ideally we would have, which is everybody controls all their data all the way through, everybody meaning the student and the family, but then we're running into, obviously, as everyone on the phone knows, the practical issues of people being in an institutional environment and institutions needing to do practical things that if they wait for every family to opt in or to give them a chance to opt out, then the system just will collapse in management nightmares. So I think that's the real one of the many tensions. There's a question for you specifically, Yvonne, about to what degree have your plans and strategies changed on privacy around due to some of the public feedback, and or where were you kind of proactive, I guess, and some of the criticism came in despite that?
Yeah, and thank you for raising that. We've been doing a lot of work on our best to communicate on that. And also whether we should change our approach. So as I said, it's a very humbling experience. We learn a lot. The first thing that is very clear to me is that, as I briefly said before, states are challenging because to do what we do, to be able to do what we do, we need the trust. And the states we work with have great intentions, but again, they're very suspicious. So clearly, we're doing much more work with the districts. That's very, very clear. The districts have a very, very good view of the problems they're facing. They have a very clear view of the problem statement and the use cases. And when we talk to districts, basically they get it for most of them very quickly. So that's one thing. The second thing we learn as well is really minimize the publicity. It's very early on, and what we're doing basically is to build some great success stories that we will publicize later. Again, as I said briefly before, I came late in the game and InBloom. Unfortunately, the train had left the station, and there were some big statements made about InBloom ambition and what we could do, the impact, and working with states and things like this. It's great, but I think it did trigger some nervousness. It did trigger some attention that was not needed. If InBloom had been a traditional startup, would have been stealth mode for a year or two, build 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 successful district implementation, and 10, and 15, and 20. Unfortunately, for various reasons, that's not the case. The third thing is on how we communicate. So as I said, we have decided to communicate less as opposed to more. It's been a complex process to get there. But we think actions will speak louder than words, and what we want to do is to build the successes. The thing we've learned during that process is that you have 3 categories of people to engage on those controversial topics. You have people like, I think some of you mentioned some names, Leonie Anson, Diane Ravitch, Class Size Matters, and others, which we tried to engage in the past, and we very quickly realized that there was really no appetite to have a constructive discussion. It became a political matter, became a platform for traction, recruiting supporters, members, and others. And some of them have told us loud and clear, InBloom, we don't care who you are, what you do. We love the fact we can create some noise and traction on that. That's very common. Again, having talked to a few people now, it's always the case. The risk is to spend all your time and energy with some of these people who have no interest to get somewhere. Then you have on the other side of the spectrum people having real good questions, people who want to find solutions. Those are the people you want to engage. People who have some really good questions, very pragmatic, and they really, really want to make things better. That's why we're spending our time more and more on. Again, discreetly, not in public, but we've engaged with a lot of names you mentioned before, got some fantastic, useful feedback for us, things we can do better in terms of the way we deal with privacy and security and on these topics. And then you have basically the large majority of people. They don't understand. They don't either care or they don't know. And they will basically follow one side or the other. And right now, the view is that we should spend most of our energy on the second group, those group of early adopters, pioneers, people who have a real interest for the truth to really get to a good right place. The third group basically will follow, and the first group basically will disappear at some point of time. That's where we stand, very transparently. It's been frustrating because sometimes we really want to engage much more aggressively with the critics, the more vocal critics. But those vocal critics basically are only fishing for ammunition to create more noise and confuse people even more. The encouraging thing is that some of those critics have so absurd comments on critics that they basically discredit themselves. Some of these folks had a lot of attention and traction in the press, and over time they're getting less and less because the facts are sometimes so crazy that even the press, some of the most vocal press folks are, feel that they can't really publish any of these things anymore. It does take time. It's very frustrating, clearly. I've decided now that InBloom is about resilience, patience, and persistence. That's typically what defines me normally, at least for the patience part, but it's a good lesson.
Maybe there's a play on your title, Yvonne, with you will bloom again next spring. So there a question about, and I think this might be our last one. Apologize for the time running out, but the question about anonymous data versus obviously personally identifiable data. I think this is sort of a two-part question. One is sort of from a perception policy point of view. How's that playing out? We're definitely seeing the two confused, or maybe intentionally confused, in that some of the policies proposed are looking to restrict the use of even anonymous information. The second part of that, maybe more for you, Yvonne, is anything you've learned on standards for making data and information anonymous. So maybe we'll start with Paige and then finish up with Yvonne.
Yeah, I don't know that I can address making data anonymous.
No, but the policy issue around data being, whether it's anonymous or identifiable.
Yeah, I think every state is going to be a little bit different in how they treat that. I think most of them have gotten the understanding that they need to have better rules and governance around how to share personally identifiable information and what are the consequences, which to date there haven't really been a whole lot of consequences. What are the consequences if something bad happens and personally identifiable information is used inappropriately or there's a breach? I don't know what we'll come out with at the end of this. We are just trying to make sure that states at least can continue along the path of collecting it and getting it at a minimum, linking with higher ed, linking with workforce, linking with early childhood, getting it back to teachers and families in an actionable way. And as long as they're not putting things into place that prohibit those kinds of activities from taking place, then we're okay. I mean, we haven't really touched the research piece of this, which gets a little bit dicier. But we're kind of holding firm on those other pieces right now.
And I think to add on that, it's really important to separate two aspects. One is compliance and research on one side, and the other side basically is instruction. A few months ago, one of our prominent CEO in the industry made some comments about that, and there was no need to collect PII. Honestly, I'm sorry, but you can't do personalized learning or individual instruction if you don't collect PII. I mean, doing stats doesn't work. I mean, if you want to individualize instruction, you need PII. It's very simple. Now, the question is whether everybody needs PII, whether every single stakeholder, I don't know, the state, the feds, whatever, need to have access to PII. And I think that's really the core of the issue is here. I don't think parents, for example, have a problem if teachers have access to personal data. That's what they have access to today. The concern is where does this data go afterwards? Is it right to send to the states PII, and what type of PII can you send? And the problem, back to what we said earlier, it's a very complex discussion. There's a hodgepodge of things. People mix everything together. Data is a big deal. Anonymized, not anonymized, the state, the district, the vendors, and others. I mean, back to your question of Mitch, who is the client? Who is the steward of the data? So there is no easy way to solve that problem. It really goes back to what problem are we trying to solve? Who should have access to what for what purpose? It always goes back to the use case and the problem statement. And that's something that needs to be addressed very, very properly, very calmly, very carefully. And right now, again, as I mentioned before, when you talk to legislators or even states officials and others, they absolutely have no clue. On the compliance side, I don't know, very candidly, I think some states require personal data that they probably don't need. I mean, they could probably be very happy and get what they want with anonymous data. As I said before, unfortunately, we, the vendors, don't make those policies. And it's very complicated because if you start commenting on policies, where do you draw the line? Why say, yes, I will collect X and Y, but I will not collect A and B? But what about C? What about D as well? So we really hope that over the next few weeks, months, or years, hopefully weeks and months as opposed to years, there will be a lot of work done on that topic to make sure there is some cleanup of who has the right to collect what, so that the vendors have clear guidelines as opposed to have to navigate through these not troubled waters, unclear environments where you're not sure exactly what you should collect, what you shouldn't collect, and so on, and treat everything the same way.
Great.
Really complex question.
Yes, we have undoubtedly just scratched the surface on a lot of these issues. So we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank Yvonne and Paige for joining us today and sharing your experience and your counsel. We will archive this webinar, and we'll send all of you the access information, and that'll be the slide deck as well as the synced audio and slide presentation. We'll be following up at SI with further activities. We'll have other related webinars, and then we'll be looking at this at our Education Government Forum coming up March 18th to 19th in DC, so please register and attend that. And I would just end with sort of echoing what we heard from Paige and Yvonne, which is that I think the more proactive that individual companies in the industry as a whole can be in being transparent and proactive in addressing these questions, the less we will be facing the prohibitions and restrictions that could be very disruptive to your abilities to innovate and serve students and schools. And so it's very challenging stuff. But the more we can get out ahead of it, and we're obviously already behind, but the more we can get out in front of this stuff moving forward, I think the better business climate SI members will have to serve and be successful. So with that as perhaps a final note, I encourage also SI members to contact me if you want to follow up on any of these issues as well. So with that, thank you, Yvonne and Paige, and we'll hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Please stand by.